Yes. So, very good morning, Professor Rosalind O'Hanlon, and very good afternoon to people who are joining in from India, and if people are joining from China and from the US, I don't know what time it is, perhaps midnight or something. Welcome to this third session of our course on approaches to history and literature with Professor Rosalind O'Hanlon. Today we'll be discussing on a theme wherein I have sent you the PDFs of the presentation that Madam will be making. So over to you, Professor O'Hanlon.
Sure. Oh, Shraddha, I think you need to allow me to share my screen.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. To this third in our series of classes, and today this is our subject, the question of what it means to be a colonial subject in the context of social change. Now, of course, this is a huge topic, and in the space of a short class, I can't possibly try to cover every aspect. So I have particularly tried to focus on those areas where gender and class and colonial knowledge come together to shape what it meant in my interpretation, and those of many others, to be a colonial subject. So just a few remarks by way of introduction. Of course, the social history of colonial South Asia is a huge now and complex field. In the last 30 years, we've had all sorts of new approaches to key concepts of class, caste, gender, community, and the like. And what post-colonial perspectives do for us, of course, is to emphasize these terms in their own local settings rather than regard them as having universal meanings. This was, of course, part of the point of the broad post-colonial critique. Again, a familiar point, following from the work of Edward Said and Michel Foucault, as I've suggested, and as many of you know, people emphasize the role of colonial knowledge in all of this. Colonial knowledge created a kind of new space and new categories for people to understand themselves, for people to think about what it meant to be an individual, what it meant to be an individual in a colonial society. Now, of course, that emphasis on the domination of colonial knowledge has problems because it suggests that in some way colonial subjects lacked agency. Their world was simply remade for them by the colonial state. And this is an area where there has been a lot of debate, the question of the agency of colonial subjects. And as we would expect, the Subaltern Studies series really has tried to emphasize that aspect of agency. Although in some of the volumes, particularly those that deal with more literary themes, it's the aspect of colonial knowledge which comes more to the fore. Now, thinking about the way in which the colonial state reconstructed what it meant to be a person, an individual, a subject, I want today to look at a number of themes. I want to focus on colonial knowledge itself. I want to focus on this term governmentality. And when somebody first said governmentality to me a few years ago, I thought, I said, what do you mean? This sounds very abstract. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. And I also want to think about the family. particularly the role of the family in the colonial era as something like a vehicle for successful colonial subjects. So it's in the family, I think, that we can see these themes of class, caste, and gender interacting with each other, particularly during the process in which the authority of the patriarchal family was reconstructed during the colonial era, and particularly in regard to property rights. And we'll be coming back to that. But I'll also be looking at some of the radical critiques of these contemporary processes, some of the ways in which contemporaries saw them. And then lastly, I want to focus on this question of the limits of colonial knowledge, particularly in the realm of caste. We're all familiar, I think, with the argument that the colonial state, the colonial era, remade caste, remade the order of caste. Some scholars have even said the colonial state invented caste, and I think that is putting things stating things perhaps too strongly. And so one of the things that I asked you to read for today, and I apologize for the fact that it's my own bit of writing, but this is where I've tried to point out the limitations to that argument and some of the longer term continuities that we can see in the caste order if we look at it. So let's turn now to look at this rather difficult and abstract term, governmentality. What is meant by that? In brief, for a lot of people, including subaltern studies, historians tended to see the colonial state, either in old-fashioned terms, as it were, as a force for modernization. Now, we don't believe that anymore. But for some subaltern historians, the colonial state is a kind of repressive monolith. It does nothing but repress and discipline and curtail and imprison and censor and all of those things. But the idea of governmentality, which many of you will know is drawn from the work of Michel Foucault, is rather a more subtle approach. And what it does is it emphasizes that all of the techniques of government that the colonial state used, that's to say counting people, forms of statistical knowledge, quasi-scientific discourses about how economies should work, the market economy, how society should work, promoting merit, promoting useful knowledge, how history should work, that history is an empirical discipline that has to be taught in India because there's no record of such a discipline in India. All of these things are not simply repressive, although many of them are, but what they also do is shift the ground on which people thought about themselves. So these are things that are kind of creative forces. They encourage colonial subjects to think about themselves in new ways. This very fancy term, governmentality, we could translate simply as a process of influence, but not just at the level of ideas, as a process of influence that happens in the institutions around you, the way the state treats you, and therefore in some ways the way that you learn to regard yourself. And one of the articles I suggested you read is the work of an absolutely outstanding historian, Ritu Birla, who is now at the University of Toronto. Some of you may have come across her work. Some of her earlier work is on Marwari communities in colonial India. And she has this very good book, her first book, you can find it easily. And she looks at the way in which Marwari communities both resisted and took advantage of forms of colonial legislation around taxation, inheritance, commercial transactions, and charitable donations. And she looks at the ways in which they, these forms of legislation helped people to think of themselves first and foremost as economic agents. I mean, a modern parallel would be the way in which modern states and modern economies encourage us to think of ourselves first and foremost as consumers. Who are we? Well, we're consumers, or we're service users. And of course, you know, until you start to think about that, you kind of think, well, it's kind of course I'm a consumer, you know, I have to buy things, I use services, I'm a service user. But of course, this is a very particular ideological construction. And we need to step back and think, this is encouraging us to think of ourselves in these particular ways. What are they? So that's the closest present day analogy that I can think of to this idea of governmentality. And in the colonial era, what the colonial state did was really to emphasize that people are first and foremost economic agents. Peasant farmers, well, can they afford to pay their revenues? Sorry about that, just went forward prematurely. Merchants, have they paid their taxes? What sort of profits do they make? Do they want to make charitable donations? So people are encouraged to think of themselves as economic agents, bound, as it were, particularly by norms of the market, which, although, of course, there were ideas of the market in pre-colonial India, it really comes to dominance in the colonial era. Now, Maori communities were actually very good at both subtly resisting this process and turning it to their advantage. And the way that they did this was to represent themselves to the colonial state as they called themselves native commercial classes. And they were able to persuade the colonial state to enact laws, particularly about inheritance and about charity, to enact laws that enabled Marwari families to privatize their family wealth, to protect their family wealth from the taxation demands of the state, and also to protect the joint family as the place, the habitation, the basis of a rather orthodox and patriarchal Hindu culture. Now, I'm going to use some photographs in this lecture, excuse me, because I think it helps us to understand the way in which this process of people reimagining themselves actually worked. Now, when we think about the ability of Marwadis to do that, to engage with the colonial state in this way, of course, one of the things that they were relying on is what we call their cultural capital. Now, this is a term that is drawn from the sociologist, very excellent sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu. And what he means by that is something which is, in fact, very easy for us to understand. We would term it know-how, legal know-how, commercial know-how, familiarity with how the colonial state works, familiarity with educational processes and procedures. And so the Maoris were very good at that. And so they were in these very effective ways to persuade the colonial state to enact these legislations which helped them protect their family wealth and which helped them to claim the tax back, if you like, on their charitable donations and all that sort of thing. So let's look here at an image of a Maori family from the 1940s, about 1940. And what's emphasized here really is the nuclear family. Here we have the patriarch, we have the wife, and then we have the 4 children. The nuclear family is the vehicle through which success and wealth can be achieved. that success is and wealth is evident there in their costly dress. But of course, the dress, whilst costly, is offset by the fact that this is a very European setting. There they are sitting on a sofa, as it were, on European style furniture. And there you see the gestures towards modernity in dress of the patriarch. There he's very much a professional man. There he has his plain coat compared with the rather gorgeous dressing of his family. His plain coat, his very neat moustache, a very rather 1940s moustache, if I can say that. So here we have a model economic citizen, sober, competent, looking sternly into the distance, his wealth present but understated. And so I think, here we see the kind of image of themselves that the families like this wanted to represent. And we're very lucky as historians that there was from the later colonial period, really even from the 1860s onwards, there comes to be a huge vogue for studio photographs of this kind. And these are very useful for us because they do enable us to see how families wanted to appear, how they wanted to present themselves. So let's look at another set of families, a little bit closer to home. So here we have three images in time: a Maratha Brahmin family of the 1880s, not quite sure where, one from the 1890s taken in Mumbai, and a Maratha Brahmin family of the 90s. I think it's Maratha Brahmin, but I may be wrong, I should say. But it's certainly a Brahmin family of the 1930s. It may possibly be a South Indian family. Now, so what we see here in these family photographs is really the same emphasis. It's a family grouping of patriarchal men as a thriving social unit, the vehicle through which its members achieve success. This is not about individuals, this is about the family as a very important social, economic, professional unit. Now, what's interesting here in the certainly for the Maratha Brahmin photographs, there's much less emphasis on costly dress than there was in the Marwari photograph. This is much more sobriety, as it were, plainness, very respectable, but not there isn't, wealth here is not flaunted. The photograph of the 1880s shows rather more tradition. It's interesting, you see this transition between the 1880s and 1890s. The 1880s, we have really rather traditional dress. By the 1890s, we have the Maratha Brahmin family. You will see the little boy in the middle in his sailor suit, which is very sweet. The patriarch there, again, he has a moustache, his coat is plain, he has a traditional dhoti underneath, but underneath a very buttoned up kind of coat. And the women there are very composed. They are clearly happy with their roles in the family group. And then in the 1930s, we have a move again. This is much more, here is a Brahmin family that is much more relaxed. These are people at home in front of the camera. They haven't, it's almost as if they have arrived, no need to dress up, dear. We can go in, we can go in our ordinary everyday wear. Some are sitting, some are standing. And although they look serious, this is a family that looks very relaxed with its obvious professional success and ability to relax in front of a camera. Now, I think what's powerful about these photographs is the way in which they bring the private and the public sphere together. These are both private family moments, but there are also moments of display and, if you like, performance. These are how the families wish to be seen, how they think of themselves. So I think photographs of this kind really give us some very nice insights into the mentality of families at the time. Now, you will have seen the article by Maureen Patterson, part of your reading for this week, which is really about changing patterns of occupation amongst Chitpawan Brahmin families in the later colonial era, the way in which, as is very familiar to many of us, they took up positions as government servants, lawyers, journalists, teachers, doctors, political intermediaries, and so on. Now, there is I just want to draw attention in this connection, thinking about the patriarchal family, to the article of Eleanor Newbegins that I recommended to you as another of your 3 articles for the week, because it touches on some key points about property rights. We can talk about that article, the arguments that she makes in the discussion, but this is also an era in which the individual family patriarch and something rather more like a nuclear family of the sort we've seen in the photographs is coming to the fore in some middle class settings as the best vehicle for professional success in the future. And we can talk about changes to property rights that made that possible. Now, let me make some of these arguments a little bit more concrete. Now, some of you, those of you particularly from Maharashtra, may be aware of a genre of literature called the Kulavratant, that is to say, the family history. And what's very interesting, and again, this is mentioned in the article on Chitpawan family history, Chitpawan occupations, Maureen Patterson. What's very interesting is that there came really from the 1920s to be an absolute real wave of enthusiasm amongst Chitpawan and then all other Brahmin communities in Maharashtra for family histories of these kinds. So you would get some elderly family member, usually somebody with time on their hands and maybe a little bit of money to back it up, who would go around interviewing branches of the family and really trying to assemble a sense for this particular Kula, and here I want to talk about the Lele family. For this particular Kula, what are the branches? Where are they? What have they done over the last 100 or more years? An important inspiration for this movement was a chap called K.V. Pense of Pune. And in 1938, he formed the Kulavratanta Sangha to encourage and promote the movement. You know, he said, look, guys, this is not just the history of individual families. These matter because these are the building blocks of the history of the nation. And that's why it's important they should be recovered and connected so that we can see the full extent of the dispersal and branching out and ultimately the success of the many families in a particular Brahmin Kula. Now, interestingly, these Kulavratantas, they were not just lists of names, but they really carried very detailed information about the circumstances of each family. Pense produced a guide how to make your Kulavratanta. And he produced a questionnaire that anybody wanting to launch a Kulavratanta for their own Kula, questionnaire these are the questions to ask. And so what we have in these volumes are very rich information about, not just about the general circumstances of the family, but about the lives of individual members. And again, most of them are stories of success: education, qualifications, professions, law, medicine, government service, politics, religious service, and so on. They also listed cultural activities, who had travelled, who had done charitable works, who liked music, who read what sorts of books, what were the achievements in sport, in television, in drama, in journalism, what were the religious sacrifices that the various family members had sponsored. And here you see in this, in the images on the right of your screen, you can see some of the first pages of the Lele Kulavratanta. And we can have a look at a little bit more of them here. These are, again, pages from the is this the Lele Kulavratanta? I think it's the, is it the Lele? Sorry, I have many of these. And so, yes, it is the Lele, yeah. So you can see on the left-hand side is a table of contents listing all of the different families that have been included in this family history, this collective family history. And then you have it illustrated in the form of a Vanshavraksha, literally a family tree. And there you see, if you can see the detail, all of the little leaves which make up the trunk, which make up the tree. And on the right, you can see the subscribers, people who have donated money to the project and made it possible. And many of these books run to hundreds of pages. They are available to you locally, more available than they are to me locally. So one of the things I do when I come to Pune is I trek around the libraries looking for Kulavratantas that I think would be good. And let's just look here a little bit more closely at an example of another Kulavratanta. And I've chosen this one because the photographs are so good. And this is the Gokhale Kulavratanta, first written in 1922. It was again updated in 1967 and then again updated in 1978. So it is now let me show you. It is now a book of some hundreds, in fact, some 1,200 pages. So you can see what a substantial book it was by 1978. Now, what are these photographs telling us? Well, here we have on the left-hand image, we have Rao Bahadur Ganesh Govind Gokhale, born in 1842, became an engineer, and then by 1890, a Pune municipal councillor. Very successful man. Here you have, at the bottom of the page, you can see his brother and his wife. And then in these second and third images, you have their sons in the next image, one of his sons and his wife, and then their sons, one of their sons and their wives and children. And in the right-hand side, you have the next generation, all of whom successful doctors, engineers, architects, and writers, right down to the nice little girl laughing there in the third image, who's clearly a little girl of perhaps 4 or 5 or 6, next to a family member who's, I think he was receiving an award for a television program. So again, these images of family success. So what these Kulavratantas, rather like the studio photographs, but with an awful lot more information, what they are doing for us are showing us really densely packed illustrations, both visual and textual, of unfolding family achievement, the striving of individually described fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, sons and daughters. And we can see the kind of trajectory from the somber patriarch of the founder of the family to the smartly dressed, smiling groups of the 1940s and 50s. So what we are shown here are sort of living embodiments of a successful passage from the late colonial, as it were, from, quotes, tradition to modern citizens. And what makes it all possible, the suggestion is the hard work, the talent, the striving, and the amiable qualities of all these family members. And the impression that we get here, and this is where I think these are distinctively colonial, is that caste here seems simply to disappear. You know, we are very aware that these are Brahmin families, they have tremendous cultural capital, but in these pages of these descriptions of success, these are sort of economic agents, professional agents. These are responsible citizens whose striving has made all of this success possible. Caste is nowhere particularly to be seen. These are simply successful individuals who have brought their talents and exercised them in the colonial and then the post-colonial era. So I think these are another example of the way in which colonial culture reconstructed what it meant to be a successful middle-class family. Now, that's all very well, but of course, there were many other contemporary observers who were looking at these processes with a very critical eye. You know, we see these as in the way that we look back. If we look at the very impressive and for me very interesting figure of Tarabai Shinde, who wrote this now I think quite well known, very early feminist critique, Stri Purush Tulana, the comparison between men and women. Here we have someone who is looking at exactly those processes whereby the family and the patriarch are riding the waves towards a successful professional life. And she is furious about it. This is one of the characteristics of this book, published in 1882 in Marathi. She was from a Satyashodak family, many of you will know, from Eastern Maharashtra, from Buldhane. She really takes these middle-class men to task. A lot of the book is directed at what we would now call double standards. A lot of the time she recounts tales of the gods from religious texts, tales of the gods that talk about, for example, the god Krishna, who disports himself with the gopis, and yet we women, she says, you know, we're not allowed to do that. We're expected at all times to be meek, modest, the ideal pativrata, the ideal virtuous wife. But an awful lot of her critique is aimed at these middle-class men. And what she is basically saying, you know, there are you middle-class men. She doesn't say that, of course, but that's effectively what she's saying. There are you middle-class men successfully entering the colonial public sphere. There you are, sort of, you've become heroes of the pen pushers. You all are, in place of what we remember as the warrior heroes of Shivaji's day. There you are with your phony reform societies, she says, referring to social reform movements. There you are with your public functions, presenting each other with awards and congratulating yourselves, and it doesn't do anybody any good. There you are, she says, you've adopted the dress, the food, the habits, even the domestic decor of the colonial masters. You spend all your time hanging around their offices in the hope of a better job. And yet you have the nerve to tell us women that we have to behave absolutely traditionally, that we have to stay at home with the family. And any time the colonial state tries to promote some social reform, you squawk loudly and say they mustn't interfere in the realm of tradition. Whereas you are out there taking full advantage of it, enjoying yourselves. This is nothing other than what we would call double standards. So in a way, I think Tarabai's critique, although of course if you had said post-colonial to her, she would have looked at you as if you were mad. Her critique is very much in the spirit of these post-colonial appreciations, critiques of the way that the family was changing. She's not having a go at people because of their caste or simply because they're men. She's having a go, she's critiquing them because of the way in which they've taken advantage of the new colonial public spaces to reconstruct themselves as new kinds of professional elite. Now, I want now to turn to some of the limits, I think, of the way in which colonialism reconstructed its subjects. We don't want to sort of go overboard thinking that there is no continuity. And what I've tried to do in my essay, Caste and Its Histories in Colonial India, is to set out some of the ways in which I think there were important continuities, and some of the ways in particular in which the new educational opportunities opened up to Bahujan and Dalit communities really enabled them to exercise the kind of agency that we might look for. And now I'll go on to talk a little bit about that. So when we're talking about continuities in structures of caste, ideologies of caste, a lot of the disputes of the 19th century, and of course for Western India, for Southern India, we think in terms of non-Brahmin movements, we think in terms of Bahujan and Dalit movements. Many of these 19th century movements had important pre-colonial precedents. In Western India, there were large communities of conservative Shastris, Pandits, who argued that in this era of the Kali Yuga, there are only two kinds of people left in the world. There are Brahmins and there are Shudras. There are no Kshatriyas because, of course, we know that Parashuram came to earth as one of the incarnations of Vishnu and killed them all. Other Shastris, particularly Shastris based in Benares, who tended to be rather more liberal, disputed this and in fact said that no, that's not right. The position is complicated. And of course, particularly when it came to the consecration of the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, a Shastri from Benares came to the court at Raigad and performed the ceremonies which recognized Shivaji as very much a royal Kshatriya. So those disputes about caste categories predate the colonial period. Now, interestingly, the Bahujan intellectuals of the colonial era were actually very well aware of this pre-colonial history. These were not people who had sort of read colonial Christian attacks on caste and thought, oh, that's a good argument, I must adopt that. They knew very well their own history. And I think we don't often enough give them credit for that. We don't often enough, because we don't study longer term processes of history. We often are simply not aware of this expertise that they had. Fule, as we've to some extent discussed, and we'll be looking again a little bit more at Fule tomorrow, Fule linked the struggles of Bahujan and Dalit communities both with the very ancient and in some ways mythic past, the coming of Aryan settlers into India, the less mythic, very concrete history, the decline of Buddhism and the rise of Advaita Vedanta under the theologian Shankaracharya. but lesser known Buddhist Bahujan intellectuals adopted a rather different and in a way much more familiarly, almost professionally historical approach. They went back to the documents. There's one of these in particular that I found very interesting to read his work, Tukaram Tatya Padwal, showed, as I'll describe in a moment, really a very detailed knowledge of the debates and of the texts that different debates, different judgments, that different assemblies of pundits, different dharma sabha, the decisions that they had made when these questions were put to them. Are there kshatriyas in the Kali Yuga? Who is a Shudra, and what are the ritual entitlements of Shudras? I think this awareness of their own history was one of the things that made Bahujan intellectuals so effective at claiming a dignified ritual life for their communities and challenging the claims that the only pure community in this era of the Kali Yuga are Brahmins. So let us look a little bit more closely at this man, very interesting man, Tukaram Tatya Padwal. There we have an early photograph of him. And there below the photograph, you'll see an image of the front page of one of his many books, Jati Bedvivekasan, a reflection on caste distinctions. He was a Bombay cotton merchant. Many of you have come across him will know. He was a Bandhari by caste, not a Mali like Phule, but he was a long-term associate of Phule's. And in fact, Phule helped him to publish this book, Jati Bedvivekasan, in 1861, very early for this kind of critique. Now, what's interesting about the title of Padwal's book is that for anyone who knew anything about the caste history of Maharashtra, the term Jati Viveka was evoked the whole long tradition of debate about caste. Very many eminent Shastris had written texts that they called Jati Viveka. They wrote them in Sanskrit. Some were very conservative. Some were more liberal. Many of the Jati Vivekas coming out of Benares were actually much more liberal. And so by calling his text Jati Bedvivekasan, an essence of thinking about caste distinctions, Padwal is placing himself very centrally in that tradition of writing. That to me is one of the very interesting things about his text. What he did in the text was to demonstrate that in this modern era, all caste communities, Brahmins included, had undergone some kind of mixing. Rather than squabble over whose pedigree was the purest, Padwal argued that sincere patriots, people who were really interested in the lives of people at every level of society, should focus on the damage that rigid caste distinctions did to everybody. So, you know, he cuts through, he situates himself in the genre of the Jati Viveka, but he cuts right through it and says, in the end, all of these things, these rigid distinctions, are imagined because nobody is pure these days. Everybody's community will show the history of mixing. And his deep learning also emerges in not just in his numerous quotations from these important texts of the Dharma Shastra, from Bhakti poetry and so on, but he also, in his appendix, he lists a lot of the Shastric judgments back from the 1700s. So he's very well aware of the background to this Gramanya, as it's sometimes called in Maharashtra, these successive, down over the generations, disputes about about caste status and identity. So what Padwal's example does for us is to remind us of something that I think we all too often forget, which is that for those on every political side in the 19th century, in the colonial era, for those taking part in these contests about caste, the knowledge, the understanding of their own pre-colonial history was an absolutely vital tool. And it was not simply remade by colonial knowledge, and it certainly wasn't invented by colonial knowledge. So I think that's an important corrective to arguments about colonial knowledge, arguments about the agency of colonial subjects and what it meant to be a colonial subject. It did not mean forgetting your own past. So let me now draw to a close for today. What I hope I've shown you really some examples of, I haven't at all tried to cover the whole field. Some new ways of thinking about what it meant to be a colonial subject, rather than thinking about the colonial state as simply repressive, rather than thinking about in terms simply of tradition or modernity. We can see the setting of the colonial state, its apparatus of legislation, the kind of economy that it encouraged, the way in which it opened up opportunities for new kinds of profession, the way that these things encouraged middle-class elites to identify with this rather distinctive colonial form of modernity, centering on the middle-class family. But of course, that still left plenty of room for independent critique, for people who saw exactly what was going on and were not afraid to speak out publicly to say so. Of course, we should bear in mind that Tarabai Shinde bore a cost for this. There is no evidence that we have that she ever had a husband or a children. She may possibly have been a widow. We're not absolutely sure for certain. I think it's likely that she was. But she was operating very much, I think, as her own agent. And we feel the force of her fury as she sees these double standards in the colonial public sphere around her. I've also emphasized that these forms of governmentality, of influences, if you like, new structures, new ways of thinking about yourself, they didn't erase pre-colonial forms of knowledge. If anything, they made an understanding of those pre-colonial traditions all the more strategically important. If you could take on an opponent and in one of the 19th century debates and produce the documents, here are the documents, what do you say to that? Then this was a very valuable tool for colonial politics. So next week, we take up this question of the pre-colonial again, this question of historical knowledges. And so I want here next week, tomorrow rather, to go back and again and think about, in what sense did pre-colonial and the India of the colonial era, the India of our present day, what forms of history writing. We've talked about history 1 and history 2. Let's look again at what those actually mean, how they were shaped in the colonial era. And we return to this very difficult question of the relationship between professional and popular forms of history writing, how they can flourish side by side. So that brings me to a close for today. So I will stop screen sharing now and hand over to Shraddha to open our discussion. Shraddha.
Yes, thank you, Professor O'Hanlon. Before we start with the Q&A announcement for the Marathi listeners, आपल्यापैकी ज्यांना मराठीमध्ये प्रश्न विचारायचे असतील त्यांनी सुद्धा जरूर मराठीमधून प्रश्न विचारा. मॅडमना उत्तम मराठी येतं आणि सहजगत्या त्या मराठीमध्ये उत्तरं देऊही शकतील आणि त्यांना आवडेल. इनफॅक्ट आमची जेव्हा कालपासून चर्चा चालली आहे की जास्तीत जास्त लोकांचा आपल्यामध्ये संवादामध्ये या सहभाग कसा होऊ शकेल, तर तेव्हा आमच्या लक्षात आलं की मराठी मंडळींचा इथे इतका सुंदर सहभाग आहे, पण प्रत्यक्षामध्ये प्रश्न मात्र मराठी मंडळींकडनं मराठी भाषेत येत नाहीयेत. तर प्लीज तसं काही मानू नका, मराठीत सुद्धा जरूर तुम्ही प्रश्न विचारू शकता आणि मॅडमना उत्तर द्यायला त्याचा आनंदच होईल. प्रश्न, कमेंट जे तुम्हाला काही म्हणायचं असेल ते. इथे आपल्या चॅट बॉक्समध्ये मॅडम प्रश्न मला एक दिसतोय आणि युट्यूब वरती सुद्धा काही आहेत. चॅट बॉक्स मध्ये वन फ्रॉम देवस्मिता, अनदर फ्रॉम अमोल बनकर. ओके, देवस्मिता, can you see Devasmita's question?
Yes, I can. मला वाचता येते. मला मराठी बोलण्याची सवय अजिबात नाही. वाचता येते, पण बोलण्याची सवय नाही आहे इथे इंग्लंडमध्ये, म्हणून माफ करा.
या निमित्ताने होईल.
मॅडम भाषांतर करणार आहे, तर म्हणून मराठीत प्रश्न विचारा. आवडेल तर मराठीत विचारा. So Devasmita, yes, I mean, in a way, I think you're absolutely right, and there are interesting anthropologists in the present day that that make the point that, of course, that we think about merit as something that, you know, is a neutral category, and people, you know, when people are applying for government jobs, that they go in through the open category or the merit category, and it's really not thought of in terms so very overtly of caste. So I think you're right. There is a connection here with the logic of family as a vehicle for professional success. I think that's a very good point. Amol, hello Amol. The influx of printed Jati Purana. Now you touch on an important point here. Obviously, one of the very major changes with the coming of colonialism is the coming of print. I haven't gone into that today because I think it's probably a slightly more familiar story. But of course, it is there in the things that we've been thinking about today. All of them depended on print. Now, the printed Jati Purane, I think, were partly an aspect of that great movement of the formation of caste sabhas, caste societies, which you can see everywhere in the later 19th, early 20th centuries, castes forming themselves into societies to promote things like to promote reform in the society, in the community, to provide scholarships for boys, to help with charitable donations to boarding houses so that scholars could go and stay safely when they attended college. Now, I think the Jati Puranas is really a part of that culture of caste societies. And of course, a Purana is a very good way of telling the history of your community. And very often these Puranas would be to do with not inventing, but looking for a new caste identity. We used to be Kshatriyas, but then there was a bad incident long back in our history. And so now people think of us as Shudras, but actually we belong to a higher caste, and we have this hidden history. It's also worth remembering that that very many, even before the colonial era, that very many of those texts that we call Puranas were caste Puranas, that they were about the histories of particular castes. Sometimes they were about the histories of particular sects. Sometimes they were about the histories of charismatic places. You know, the Puran is a vehicle for histories, for recalled, told, mythic combinations of both, vehicles for histories of very many different kinds. So, but I think that what you mentioned about the profusion of 19th century Jati Puranas has to do with this, the fact that this is an era in which caste communities were trying to get themselves organized, the better to engage with the colonial world. Now, going down, Bapurao Gungarao Gankar, and this is a YouTube question. Thank you, Bapurao. Why did Shivaji feel the need to reveal himself as a Kshatriya? And to what extent can we see him as a revivalist of Hinduism in modern Maharashtra? So that's a very good question. And in a way, it's a question that is very close to home, a sensitive question. And what I would always do when thinking about a question like this is to look at Shivaji's context. So in the 17th century context, in which all lords, all aspirants to rulership in which they lived, you could not make a credible claim to rulership unless you were a Kshatriya. You simply couldn't do it. That was what a king was. Kings were, by their nature, were Kshatriyas. Now, it's useful to remember that this was not so in every part of 17th century India. If we look at the south, if we look at the the caste order of southern India, there are no communities in southern India that conventionally claim that Kshatriya status. It's a very curious thing. It seems to be something very much that was alive in northern and central India. In South India, the prestige of a king came not from anything to do with his caste. It came from the fact that he was the premier, the first worshipper of the goddess in the temple. Now, and many kings of the south would say perfectly happy, sure, I'm a Shudra, but come and see my temple, come and see the wealth that I have been able to donate to the glory of the goddess, and then tell me I'm not a person of importance. And historians debate, why is this so that kings in southern India didn't have this sense that being a Kshatriya was part of being a king. And I think part of the answer lies in the fact that southern India was very much more, very wealthy, booming cash economies, and your status was so much more bound up with the wealth that you could bestow on the temple. So it's something to do with the caste order in southern India in this pre-colonial era, I think is much more bound up with the booming cash economy of the time, which stands in contrast to the if I can put it, the more famine-prone, the less wealthy societies of central India, and to some extent of the north, although that's not in a way in a different sense. Now, the second half of your question, to what extent can we see him as a revivalist of Hinduism in Maharashtra? Of course, Shivaji is no longer with us as a historical actor. He had his own meanings in his own time. And it's important that we show such figures the respect and understanding that they deserve, that we try to see their world through their eyes as far as we possibly can. Now, of course, in the society and the arguments of the present day, there are many who would claim Shivaji for a whole range of different political projects. And in fact, this is nothing new. If you look back at the later colonial period, everybody was trying to claim Shivaji as the icon of their project. Phule did it with his Ballad of Shivaji. For Phule, Shivaji was the first person, really, the first king to care about his peasant subjects. For others, for someone like Ranade, and you read Ranaday's text earlier in the week, The Rise of the Maratha Power. For Ranade, Shivaji was a slightly different character. He represented, as it were, the whole of Maharashtra's society coming together, led by the values of bhakti, led by the egalitarianism of Maharashtra in those days. And so he was able really to launch the bid for independence against the Mughal North. So trying to appropriate Shivaji, trying to appropriate any character from history, let alone someone as charismatic as Shivaji, is something that happens all the time. And not just in India, it happens everywhere. In the UK, it happens with us, it happens with great figures like Churchill, people trying to appropriate Churchill for their own present day projects. So the two, I think, if I can say, Jyoti, on YouTube, the two, the Shivaji of his time and the Shivaji of our times, they have different meanings, and how can it be otherwise? So I hope that will be useful there for Jyoti Sangwan when he comes to listen to YouTube or to look at the comments later. A question now from Nabila, and I do want to reiterate Shraddha's message. Please do, if you want to ask a question, a verbal question, stick your hand up. At the moment, I'm looking at questions in the chat box. A question from Nabila. I recall Partha Chatterjee referring to language, etc., as belonging to an internal autonomous cultural sphere. Well, there are two parts to your question here. Now, of course, I think this was, Partha Chatterjee has this very famous construction that, there is the inner sphere of the family, which people thought of as that sacrosanct sphere, the last sphere of colonial society that was protected from colonial culture, and then there's the public sphere. Now, I guess that even Partha now would probably want to modify that picture. The family was absolutely not an autonomous sphere, even though Indian patriarchs, and to some extent the colonial state with its talk of protecting the sphere of tradition and the family and culture, not interfering, particularly after the Mutiny Rebellion of 1857, the image was, of course, that the family was autonomous. But the reality was, and this is an absolutely key point, I think, and it's an obvious point, but it bears repeating, that this is the era in which was being constructed one of colonialism's most important, most powerful, and you could argue most damaging legacies. And that is the notion that there are two kinds of law. there is public law, and then there are personal laws. Now, that's a colonial construct. For those, I mean, and it's a construct that, of course, Eleanor Newbegin touches on in her account of the making of colonial, the whole notion of personal laws. And of course, India still struggles, and to some extent Pakistan, or not to some extent, the subcontinent, across the subcontinent, these are really the only places in the world which still have something like personal laws, so that it becomes very difficult for men and women to be the same kind of citizen. You don't bear the same relationship to the state if you have personal laws. Because, of course, particularly as a woman, you find yourself bound by personal laws, and personal laws are much more under the control of family patriarchs. So the first part of your question, Nabila, I think it's important for us not to see through the whole pretense that the family was some autonomous sphere. Then for the second part of your question, is really about the colonial sphere of language and the impetus to language politics. Well, that's a very big question. It's hard to tackle in the space of a single answer. I mean, I think I would just want to say two things. One is that the coming of print and the standardization of vernacular languages did mean that it became difficult for people not used to that kind of register of writing or speaking to participate in the colonial public sphere, in newspaper arguments and debates, in the meetings of learned societies or caste communities, and so on. So that's one of the ways in which colonialism and language interact to reshape the public sphere. Of course, colonial language politics, the story of the separation between Urdu and this new language called Hindi, Sanskritized Hindi, and the part that played later in India's partition. That story is quite a well-known one. I can't really, no point in retailing the details of it here, but I think those are two areas in which language and language politics substantially reshaped societies. Now, let me, Anne-Marie, you've got your hand up. Let's just hold it there for a moment, because just to see if we can find some people who would either like to ask questions in Marathi or who haven't contributed yet to our discussions, who haven't found a space for them to involve themselves in discussion. Now, there's a question here. Now, is this from Sagar Naik? Anyway, I'll look at Professor Badri Narayan talked about popular and alternative discourses on history, but that its approach to the Aryan invasion is based on racist premises. What do we think about that? Well, I think the first thing to say about that is to agree. If we're talking about Aryan race, an Aryan race, which is what Max Muller, who first coined the term an Aryan, or who first spoke in terms of an Aryan race and an Aryan invasion, if you like, of the subcontinent, he spoke of race. Now, he wasn't ashamed to speak of race. And again, we go back to the mid-19th century context. In that context, to speak of race came as naturally to speak of men and women, naturally to speak of any other kind of sociological category. for people in those days, race was something that was self-evident. Now, for us, of course, our long period of education, of growing sociological understanding and sophistication, and above all, the painful experience that we have gathered as to what happens when you believe that actually there are things that are races, that the idea of race represents a real bio-social category. We know now what happens when you believe those things. We understand that such attitudes underlay slavery. We understand that such attitudes helped to bring about the Holocaust in Europe. We understand that such attitudes underlay the coming of the Nazis to power. We know from our painful experience, as well as our much more sophisticated scholarly understanding, that there is no such thing as a race. This is an outmoded sociological term of the 19th century. And this is why we now use this term of deep criticism, racist. You know, if there is one thing that you do not want to be called because you understand the history behind it, it is racist. So what I would say to you, Saga, is that to call those of the middle 19th century, to call them as racist, is true, but it is applying the standard of one time to the common sense of another. Now, with our own judgment, we would far rather be, in our own time, understanding what dealing with terms, assuming that races exist and are a valid way of looking at society. We now know how deeply damaging and in every way unacceptable those terms are. But if you'd said to Max Muller, you're a racist, he would say, well, what do you mean by that term? I've never heard that term before. And if you were to say, well, it means that you believe there are such things as races and so some are more superior than others, he would have said, well, of course. I mean, that everybody knows that. So I hope that gives you a kind of historical perspective on that 19th century knowledge, which very thankfully, for all that in our own time we are continue to make such terrible humane mistakes, at least that construction, the ideological construction of race, no longer goes unchallenged in our own times. So that is, I hope, useful to you there. Now, I have a question on YouTube, GK Santosha, and then Anna-Marie, I will come to your question. You've been waiting very patiently. What are the literary contributions through which we can better understand colonial history? Well, that's a very big question, GK Santosha GK. I hope you am calling your name correctly. This is a question that I will deal with in more detail tomorrow. And so I hope you will forgive me if I don't go into that too very deeply here, because tomorrow I'm going to be looking a little bit more closely at exactly this question. Literature will always be an important source for historians in at least two ways. One, that reading the literature of a time gives you insights into its mentality. And two, very often we can find in literature evidences that if we can match those with other evidence, that it seems to corroborate often literature can be a direct historical source for us. But if you will bear with me, I will come back to that question tomorrow. Anne-Marie, you've waited very patiently. Let me please do ask your question.
Thank you, Professor. It's not a question that I have. I just had a comment to make regarding what you said a few moments back about South India not having too much emphasis on the birth of the king being Kshatriya or not. I am from Kerala, and I have a different story to say.
Sure, yes.
So this was an article that I read, which was written by Manu S. Pillai. And in the article, it was written that Martanda Varma, the king of Travancore during 1750s, he was not Kshatriya when he came into power. But then he did this religious ceremony where a model of cow was made out of gold, and he would enter through the mouth of the cow and sit inside the womb. It's emphasized that it's the womb of a mother, and the Brahmin priest would give all these rituals, and then he'll come out of it as a Kshatriya. So this was that show that he is also born as a Kshatriya, and that he'll have a better power over his people, and that they respect him. And in the article, it was also mentioned that during this time, even the Tamil country, in Tamil country also, such practices were held. And there was another instance also written in it, mentioning that, so the king of Cochin, he was of high caste. And there was an instance where once Martanda Varma, when before the whole Kshatriya, the ritual was done, when Martanda Varma had to meet the king of Cochin, he was not placed in the same. So when they had to sit, he was not placed in the same level as the king of Cochin because he was of a lower caste. So I mean, I just wanted to comment on that. That's it. Thank you.
No, thank you, Anne-Marie. I mean, that's a very good point. I'm generalizing when I say southern India. You know, I think I probably had more in mind, particularly the Tamil country. But it's also undoubtedly the case that this ideology of Kshatriya identity was sometimes influential in every part of India. I mean, something I think that if you look at Indian political traditions, particularly the pre-colonial political traditions, you often find that aspirant rulers, people who are aiming to establish their own new state, will adopt what we would call a kind of belt and braces approach. That's to say, you know, you make sure that every possible aspect is secured. You go through a Kshatriya ceremony. You also make major offerings to the goddess in the temple. You also get Brahmins to write you a very elaborate genealogy. You also get a sanad from the local ruler. And particularly, I think, over the course of from the later 18th century, with the coming of the East India Company, I mean, I'm thinking in particular of Mysore. Of course, the East India Company certainly had a very, you know, when they displaced Tipu Sultan and they reinstalled the old Wodeyar kings of Mysore, they then encouraged them to adapt a more Brahmanic, a more North Indian idiom of kingly culture, and with the sort of Kshatriya identity and the rest of it. So you know, the situation is more mixed than my generalization suggested. You're absolutely correct. But I think there are settings in the South. I'm thinking in particular of that wonderful book, Symbols of Substance, by Subramaniam et al., which talks about a Shudra king, who glories in the fact that he's a Shudra. And you just think, well, that really wouldn't have been possible if that ruler had been in Rajasthan, for example. So you're right, it's a more mixed picture than I suggested, and apologies for that generalization. Thank you. Now, Nabila, I see a question from you there, but let's just see if there is anyone else that would like to chip in. Anyone who hasn't yet found a spot to join the conversation?
Yes, from YouTube, there's Santosha GK, literary contributions to record colonial history. In literary sources, I guess.
Is that? Oh yes, I think. Yeah, I think in fact I've answered that one. Have I? Rather briefly, perhaps.
Sorry.
I think that's right. But let's see. Are there others from YouTube or others who haven't asked a question? Now, in my classes in Oxford, sometimes the students tell me I am very terrifying. Now, why do they tell me I'm very terrifying? Because sometimes, if nobody has a question to ask, then I volunteer someone. So I may just look down the names in front of me and just ask individuals whether they would like to join. And if I do this, I hope you will forgive me if I do this. And if you would not want to join, please say, no, thank you, madam. So let us just have a look. Now, I see I have a gentleman, Tukaram Shinde, in the Zoom meeting. Now, Tukaram, I don't know if you're there or you would like to ask a question, but I don't believe you've felt you wanted to join or seen a comment that you'd like to make. I don't know if you would like to join us. If you're there, is that I don't want to embarrass people.
So very much there in the department. Let me just
Tukaram, you're there in the department. So well, perhaps you would have a think. See if you can have a think about whether there is anything that you would like to share with us. Let me have a look now. See whether there are any others. This is why my students tell me that I'm very terrifying. So let me just see. A minute. Tamana. Now, you haven't, Tamana Nangia, you haven't joined our discussion. I don't know whether there's anything that you would like to contribute or an observation or a question at all. People are very shy, I see.
Hi, ma'am.
Tamana, welcome. How very kind of you.
I didn't really have a lot of stuff to say, but I was trying to, what you said about colonial subject and all that. I was trying to, relate it with some of the experiences of, some of the stuff I have read about, the women actually.
Right.
So there's one poem in particular that I read. It's Parda by I'm forgetting the name, but it basically deals with the Parda system and all that. Right. It's but not really the Parda as in the Muslim sense, but in the Hindu sense also. So I was trying to kind of take that colonial subject thing to that sense. So that is what I'm building on right now. I'm thinking about it.
Right. Well, so Tamara, thank you for your question, and that's a very nice observation. It connects with some of the themes that we've been discussing about the public sphere. And as Tamara quite rightly points out, veiling in this period was really of two different kinds. There is what we normally think of as parda, that's to say a Muslim form of veiling, in which the woman essentially veils to a greater or lesser extent to go outdoors. And then there is what you might call the non-Muslim veiling, in which a woman essentially often using the pudda of a sari, or some more a greater form of covering, will veil in front of senior family members, in front of male family members, in front of visitors, actually within the home. And so both of those forms of veiling, I think, had to be rediscovered in the colonial era. Why? Well, first of all, if you were a Muslim woman, then the question was, how could you go, in the colonial era, of course, whether it came to going to the market or going to law courts or attending meetings, meetings of caste or religious community societies, there are very many settings in which people, women, found increasingly that they wanted to go out into the public sphere. So in order to do that, they needed new forms of dress. And very often for Muslim women, that the more all-encompassing forms of veiling were actually very emancipating, because they enabled women to go out in public. We look at them, we think of them as, this is very terrible that a woman should have to cover herself so completely. But in fact, for those women, this was a liberation. It meant that, she could go to the market. It meant that she could go to and hear a lecture. It meant she could, in some settings, go out to work. Then other forms of veiling. I mean, I like to think of veiling, Tamana. I think this is an approach I would, you might want to think about, to think of veiling not just as an isolated practice of dress, but in terms of the whole dress, the whole of a woman's dress. Now, of course, in different parts of India, there are different practices of tying the sari. And all of you, I think those of you in Western India may remember your grandmothers or great-grandmothers wearing the full sari, the 9-yard sari, which is kind of in which the lower part of the leg is revealed. It kind of goes between the legs like a little bit like a dhoti. And of course, in the colonial period, there was a lot of feeling that if women wanted to go out in public, how can she go out and show her legs like that? So you want something which will cover the body, as people used to say to me, of the 6-yard sari, at least it covers the body. So there are forms of modesty that required women to make changes in their dress. And of course, the convenience of a sari is that you can always use the pulu, the pudda, to, in a very flexible way, either just to kind of drape it a little bit over the back of your head. If you just have a senior family member visiting, perhaps you wish to show some respect, or if you want to more completely conceal your face, you can pull it right over your face and hold it there for that time. So I think, Tamana, you want to think about in the present day or the period that you're looking at, to think about women's dress as a whole. How are women trying to adapt their dress as a whole? And how is a society thinking about the body? Does it see the body as something, all of which has to be covered, that it's wrong to show your arms and your legs? And of course, this is not something simply in the Indian setting. All societies have shifting conceptions, particularly about the female body. What part of the female body is kind of erotic? What part of the female body is forbidden, has to be hidden from view, and so on. So I hope that helps you, Tamana, and thank you very much indeed for answering, for joining the discussion. And I do apologize for having volunteered you. I hope you'll forgive me. Now let's look at some other questions.
Buddha hasn't asked a question, I said.
Prabhupada, let's ask, have we had Meghana Aurora? Have we heard from Meghana? Perhaps not. I'll take these two, and I'll take Meghana on from YouTube, and then I'll take Prabhupada from the Zoom meeting. How do we understand culture? Well, very good question. You know, culture, in some people say culture is just the word that we reach for when we don't want to say society. Culture is just a woolly phrase. Why do we really need it? Well, I think we need the term, you know, so what's the difference between culture and society? Well, the point, if you take the concept of society, there's an implication of something as a whole, that you have a society, the society. There is, you know, an implication of a kind of connectedness of the wholeness, which we may actually not want to. Once we think like that, we may say, actually, no, society is not the word I want. So culture, I think, is that realm where, and if I can just put it very briefly, and in a way that you've correctly said, it's the realm where practice and the world of the imagination, the world of thought, the inner world, it's where the world of meaning, it's where practice and meaning overlap. So I think that's the best answer I can give you. It's just useful to know, useful to think, you know, why would we choose the word culture rather than the word society? Culture, I think, gives us more latitude in terms of things that we want to investigate. And the centrality of culture in the way that we talk about things these days, I think, is also to be welcomed, because it means that we recognize the importance of that realm where meaning and the material world intersect, overlap, inhabit each other. Because it's what opens up the world of gender, the world of caste, the world of marginal people. That it's through the study of culture very often that those forms of history, those forms of literature and of study have taken their rightful place in the world of scholarly investigation. Now, Prabhupada, ek minute, can you please describe the high caste Hindu woman of Pandita Ramabai and Tarabai Shinde in the context of nationalism? Well, these are two very different women writers, of course. Pandita Ramabai, a Christian convert, an ex-Brahmin, a widow, who was really writing a tract against the terrible plight of high caste widows. And you will all understand why that was such a terrible plight, because in a society where life expectancy was relatively low, if you were widowed, if you were a member of a high caste which looked down on widow remarriage, of course, it condemned you to a lifetime of loneliness, solitude, very often sexual exploitation within the family, sometimes sati. Now, Tarabai Shinde is also furious at the plight of Hindu widows. It's the thing that she most fixes on when she's talking about the double standards. So both of them are thinking about Hindu widows, but with a different tales, different critiques to make, and coming from a different context. You know, Tarabai Shinde, small town, writing in Marathi, very controversial views, whereas Pandita Ramabai was celebrated particularly by Christian missionary organizations, traveled to America, very accomplished woman in the public sphere, in a way that Tarabai Shinde wasn't. Now, of course, for both of these posed a challenge to nationalism. Nationalism, of course, is an umbrella term for very many different movements. But in any colonial setting, and this is the dilemma, of course, another dilemma of colonialism, which is that any internal critique of social practices seems to be, at one level, anti-national, particularly if those critiques seem to echo the critiques of the colonizers themselves. So I think that's, very broadly, that is how Prabuddha, you would relate those two texts broadly to the nationalist movement. So now, where should we, Niyati, very good question. What was the reception of Tarabai Shinde's text? Well, it was received, as you might expect, with extreme hostility. Very few people bothered to review it in the press. Those that did criticized her as a madwoman, criticized her poor language skills, couldn't even write proper Marathi. It tells us something that, as far as we know, she never wrote anything again. Which is quite a sad thing, really. And even there are some contemporary recollections of her as a local figure. And those contemporary recollections of her tell us something about the way she was regarded. And people recalled her, or she was a very angry looking woman. She had thick glasses. Children would run away when she came. I think there's a reference to her carrying a stick. Maybe she needed it for, maybe in her later years, she needed a walking stick. But you can see the kind of hostility to her there in those accounts by contemporaries. People who obviously just gave their recollections of her at the time. Angry woman, children ran away from her. I mean, what more condemnatory things could you say about someone? That I hope, I think it's quite a sad tale, really, a tale of courage, a tale of cost, of personal cost, speaking out like that. And of course, if you compare her as an author with the very many Satyashodak authors that we know about. Now, of course, for many of them, they too their books were also badly reviewed, but badly reviewed in newspapers that you would expect a bad review, newspapers like Kesari or the Maratha, fairly middle of the road, in some cases conservative nationalist newspapers. But those male authors, it was very rare for a male author to write one thing and never write again. They had communities of people like them to draw on for support, to tell them that they were doing well, to affirm them, in a way that I think Tarabai probably didn't. At least she had it, as far as we understand it, she had encouragement within her family and the immediate Satyashodak colleagues of her father. But that was it. She didn't have a community of fellow authors. And we now know, those of us who write for a living, how important those communities are, how to get that affirmation of colleagues to keep up our confidence. So I hope that's a useful answer, Niyati.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, who should we go to next, Shraddha, I wonder? Harshita has been waiting very patiently. Have we heard from Sonali. I'm not sure, we haven't heard from Sonali. Sonali, please let us have your question.
My question is specifically with regard to Tarabai Shinde's text.
Right.
On one hand, she's also obviously critical of the hypocrisy of men of her times, but it also seems that she is also critical of the Western lifestyle, its adoption, for example, of food or clothing, etc. That we also see in later nationalist criticism of colonialism. But on the other hand, she is also showing her faith and in the colonial rule of law. So how do we understand this ambiguity that exists in her thought, and which we also see in other Satyashodak or non-Brahminical thinkers?
Yes, yes, yes. No, you're absolutely right, Sonali. Her position is a complex one. It's an ambiguous one. And, you know, I think that brings me back to something, you know, the position of the colonial subject itself, which is in most cases, ambiguity is part, it comes with ambiguity. Because, you know, unless you are someone like Tilak, that's to say an out and out, tooth and nail opponent of the colonial state, you're going to be stuck in this difficult position that on the one hand, you appreciate that the colonial state has helped create this situation whereby there are terrible double standards, the colonial state, you know, as Fule himself said, and my guess is that Tarabai Shinde would have appreciated this, that the colonial state had been complicit in causing enormous suffering, particularly amongst the peasant poor, and at the same time standing back and not doing very much as merchant and high caste communities entrenched themselves in positions of affluence and influence. So what are you to do? So this again, I think, is where we want to try, and it's, you know, I'm simply saying the obvious. We want to try and enter into the position of someone like Sonali. On the other hand, we hate much of what the colonial state has done. On the other hand, there are some things about it which seem to us good, which seem to us valuable, but particularly for women. And for some people, of course, you know, I've criticized the colonial invention of this notion of personal law, and with good reason, because personal law particularly bore down on women, because, you know, you didn't have independent access to the legal machinery of the state. You had to depend on family law, and very often family law was under the control of patriarchs. But a change that the colonial state did make was that in the realm of criminal law, everybody is equal before the law. Whereas in the pre-colonial era, of course, you know, if you were, the legal position depended on your caste. So, you know, you might be a Brahmin and commit murder, but you could not yourself be put to death, because that would be a mortal sin in those terms. So, you know, if you were a colonial subject and you thought that equality before the law was a good thing, you know, what were you going to do? And so I think this is the answer. I mean, we need simply to accept that as a colonial subject, ambiguity, hybridity, mixing, complexity is part of your situation. You can't get away from it. And then we want to ask ourselves, if I was in that position, what would I do? So I hope that gives you some sense there of that.
Yes. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Sonali. Thank you very much. Now, Harshita, you've been waiting patiently. What would you like to contribute? What would you like to ask?
Good morning, Professor. So I had two questions. I'll just start with the first. So does the new nuclear family that emerged that you were discussing about with the colonial modernity, does it also alter notions of masculinity and impose new codes of morality per se? Because I mean, this 18th, 19th century is also a period where the courtesan culture kind of sees a decline. And my second question was that in the photos that you were showing in the beginning, so in your work with photographic archives, have you observed much of an emotional variation in the way people are? Because all these pictures were sort of like with people being kind of emotionally muted, for lack of a better word. So do you see much of an emotional range when we explore these family pictures per se?
The first part of your question, I mean, I think it's very clear that the colonial state, that colonialism did remake codes for norms, as it were, for men and women. Those norms were still class bound, still very much connected with class. I won't go on too much about that. You can see, in some of the newspaper literature, some of the social reform debates, new norms for women who were, we have a guest. New norms for modern wives. We have new norms for patriarchal men. The idea of the home as a place where people sought refuge, where people could be supported, where people could display their class accomplishments, comes into being in new ways. So, I mean, we shouldn't think that that constructions of masculinity and femininity were changeless until the coming of colonialism. States, Indian states, all states like to shape norms for men and women. Why? Not least because the institution of marriage is important for states, because it's so bound up with property rights, with the reproduction, the social reproduction of the population. So the colonial state redrew norms for men and women in just the same way that you would, with different things emphasized, but that's certainly something that you would look for. Now, the photographs, I want to emphasize that, that this foray into photographs is just a little side interest of mine, and there are many people, particularly Christopher Pinney, who have done very good work, substantial work on photographs in a way that I haven't. But Harshita, I'm not sure that I agree that the photographs convey a limited social range. I think emotion is there, I think, and different emotions are there. You have to, in trying to read those emotions, you naturally want to bear in mind the setting in which the photographs were taken. I mean, if you've ever, gone to a photographic studio to have your family photograph taken, you will know everything that goes into it. What should we wear? Who should stand where? Can grandma stand? No, she must sit. Where is little brother going to sit? Why should he sit in the middle? All of these things. So a lot of behind the scenes negotiation in which you're very conscious about the kind of family you're going to project and the place of individuals in it. And then the moment when the photograph is taken. And of course, the thing to remember about cameras in those days was that very often to expose the photographic plate where the image would be printed, you had to stand there perhaps for 30 or 40 seconds and not move. So that itself makes for a kind of rigidity in the image. But also, I think if you look at the faces, you do see emotions there. You see emotions of solemnity, seriousness. You see pride. You see the dynamic of a family group in the way that it's people are standing. In the photographs that are, we also want to look at the background. How has the family chosen to be photographed? Are they sitting, standing? And then, of course, there are the less formal photographs. The photograph of the little girl. It was absolutely, something terribly nice has clearly just happened to her. She's just laughing as any little child would. But of course, it is included in this collection of Kulavratanta photographs. So I'm not sure I completely agree that emotion is absent in those photographs. It's muted, certainly, but you would expect that. And then what one wants to try and do by looking closely at the image, to try and figure out the back history of that photograph. What does that photograph tell us about how that family wants to be seen, aside from the expressions on the faces? I hope that helps, Harshita, does it?
Yes, thank you.
Now, who else? Shraddha, please go ahead.
Just a piece of information to chip in with the Gokhale Kulavratanta. The person who was shown receiving some kind of a felicitation, he went on to be, or probably he already was, a very famous Marathi actor, Mohan Gokhale. And yes, his daughter is also a very popular Marathi actress of the new theatre movement.
Yeah.
So the cultural capital probably went on accumulating.
Yes. Yes. No. I think that is. I'm most interested to hear that, and I hope the Gokhale family will forgive my using some of the Kulavratanta for this lecture. It's probably worth emphasizing that in highlighting the middle class family as a vehicle for professional success, this is nothing new. If you look at 18th century families, and in my year or two back, I did a little bit of work on families, Maratha families, Maratha Brahmin families, who worked as diplomats in the Peshwa era. So they worked as vakil, and their whole lives as vakils was based on the family. So very often, you would get one family member deployed as a vakil to a Rajput state, a brother employed as a vakil to Hyderabad, another brother back in Pune reporting into the Peshwa court. And in that setting too, families operate as economic units in a way which is entirely familiar to us in the present day. But I think what's different about the colonial era is that it is rather more the nuclear family that operates, that is the unit, whereas in the pre-colonial, it's more the extended family. And in the colonial era, as we've have been discussing, it is the family unit that comes to the fore and the caste that goes into the background, that somehow doesn't seem to be there quite so assertively as it is in the 18th century. So family is nothing new, but it takes on a different form, I think, in the colonial period. So I hope that's useful there, but interesting that the Gokhales have got this continuing history of success. And that is the point of cultural capital, is you hand it down. Now, other questions now? Anyone not had a chance to join the discussion who would like to? I don't know whether there are any YouTube questions that we didn't get around to yesterday that people might be interested to discuss.
Did you answer that one about the public reception of Tarabai Shinde's?
Yes, I think I touched on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think I touched on that.
Yeah, so that is the last one from YouTube.
Well, let me volunteer somebody else now. Tanya Berman, what about you now? Can I embarrass you and ask if you have any observations that you'd like to make? I don't know if you've got your mic on there, Tanya Berman. You see now why my class. Tanya, hello, please.
Good morning, ma'am. Thank you. I was quite surprised when I read Tarabai Shinde's work, and what caught my attention was in the introduction where the author suggests that she's been portrayed as lacking feminine qualities, and which could perhaps be sort of like a later date addition to, you know, how she was perceived because of her actions and so on, which is very striking to which is very similar to actually what I asked in the first session about how women were presented as, and I'm sorry if I keep coming back to the same sort of. So yeah, I think, I mean, if you could sort of comment on this sort of obsession, I think, with sort of talking about women who have some sort of political control or power or voice in sort of or at least setting them in sort of masculine frames, and how that figure in post-colonial literature, in sort of how we reflect on the past through all the readings that we've done so far, even with in Badri Narayan's work, and even today in Eleanor Newbegin's article and yours as well, that there is of course a hint of this gender this arena, but in the sense that if you could sort of comment more on that.
Thank you, Tanya. That's a good question to come back to. I mean, when we look at those recollections of Tarabai, of course, we must, so I think that introduction was written sort of in the 1970s. So clearly that was somebody at the time dipping into popular memory. So that impression possibly wasn't gained directly from somebody who was alive in her lifetime, but may well have been an impression that was handed down. Oh, you know, she was very controversial, wasn't she? Didn't she write that very angry book? What was she like? And you can sort of hear people, you can almost hear people, the way in which those kinds of impressions would be passed down. Oh, she was a very angry looking woman. I never saw her, of course, but you know, my auntie told me she was always angry. Children hated her. They would run away when she came. So, you know, one wants to think about an impression like that. How would the person who passed on that impression, where would they have got it from? So I suspect this is more like a tradition that's handed down rather than something that is got, if you like, from the horse's mouth, from someone who directly had seen her. In terms of women's, you know, in terms of the reputation of women's difficulties in operating in the public sphere as writers, as in politics, as anything, these sorts of things. I mean, and this is slightly taking the discussion in a different direction. I think that in very many cases, women now operate in the public sphere in ways that look to us much more acceptable, much more accepted, with one exception, and that is sexuality. So, you know, if you can be accepted as a woman, you can be accepted as a serious journalist, as a serious politician, as a serious medical person, as a serious professional. But the one thing that it seems to me, and I'd be interested in your impressions, the one thing you cannot do as a woman, if you wish to be taken seriously, is to be a sexy woman. If you're a guy, of course you can be, you know, have a roguish twinkle in your eye, wear a sharp suit, and to be taken seriously. If you want to be taken seriously as a woman, you have to desexualize yourself. And that seems to me the kind of, you know, if you like, the last no-go area. You know, I'm sure you can think of examples of politicians who have slightly strayed into the, you know, by a mistake of the dress, by a mistake of, you know, some nuance in their voice. You know, we had this, the woman who became our Prime Minister, Theresa May, a couple of years ago. About 20 years ago, she once wore a pair of quite stylish shoes. So they were like, they had those kitten heels, little pointy heels, and they were leopard skin pattern. And she had given a serious political interview. She was a serious politician, and all the papers wrote about was her shoes. And for about 15 years after that, really almost until she became Prime Minister, the most interesting thing about her was her shoes. Oh, what do you think that means? Theresa May, very serious on the surface. But, you know, look at her shoes. What does that tell us about her behind the scenes? So, you know, I think this is an area, and I'm sure you will have all kinds of examples from your experience about women politicians in the present day. If you want to damage a woman politician, what you do is you link her with some kind of, if you want to damage a woman who wants to be taken seriously, you know, if they're not a film actress or someone whose business it is to do that, then you call it into, you know, you bring their sexuality into it. So I think, Tanya, in our own times, that to me is the problematic. It's not that it's difficult for us anymore to be academics or to be journalists or politicians, but we have to guard that if we want to be taken seriously. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, ma'am, it does. In fact, I was also going to point that out, that even in India, I mean, there's so women politicians have to have such a sanitized sort of image of themselves, and the kind of clothes they wear, the kind of sort of the lack of sort of personal that can be like freely talked about and things like that. And therefore, yes, I think like you have to constantly sort of guard that sort of human part of you in some sense, and, you know, present a very sort of sanitized imagery, which is exactly what you said.
Yes, I think that's right. So it's interesting. A tactic that I think many women use or offer is motherhood, because there is nothing so desexualizing as motherhood. So what you'll often find with many women politicians is they emphasize their motherhood, because if you're a mother, then, you know, it's kind of that's a safe place to be. It's a good place to be. And so when we look at the way that motherhood is represented, I think it has that significance. It's always desexualizing. Now, Jatin, you have a question, and there's one from Santosha GK. Let me take up Jatin's question. In what ways did governmentality play out in charting roles and norms for different caste communities, particularly for the low castes? Well, there are some very obvious ways that we know about that, and that's to say that, for example, is the colonial invention of the so-called criminal castes and tribes. You will all have heard of that category that the colonial state invented for Dalits. People, as they thought, you know, these were people who were on the margins of society. So the colonial state identified them as professional thieves. So these are people whose caste is as professional thieves, professional dacoits. And so it adopted a whole range of measures, as colonial officials thought, to wean them off these criminal practices. Sometimes it settled them in villages, government villages, to try to give them useful, honest occupations. The whole, by categorizing them as criminal castes and tribes, of course, it brought them into, you know, it helped to create a different kind of identity. In other ways, for Bahujan and Dalit communities, it brought to the fore, I'm thinking of Vital Ramji Shinde's Depressed Classes Commission. You know, this category of depressed classes came to be an important category for local social reformers. The norms that were prescribed there were very much norms that you castes are really in a very degraded, very ignorant, very dirty, very criminal position. And your job is really to reinvent yourselves, is to find ways to become useful, clean, honest members of society. Now, of course, the fact of the matter is that most of those Dalit communities served very useful and important functions in society, whether it was by the traditional Dalit watan of clearing dead animals, of cleaning villages, whether it was by acting as village spies, village watchmen. So it was not the case that they were useless or degraded, although in a sense, from our perspective, they were. So if you can see that, Jatin, the image of themselves that was held out was an image of utter degradation. They had to learn to be new people again, and that's what the colonial state would have wanted. And of course, it made the actual experience of many of them extremely difficult. You know, how do you reinvent yourself, particularly if you're stuck in some government village? I mean, another way, probably the most important form of upward social mobility that the colonial state offered to low caste communities was in the military. And of course, Ambedkar himself, Dr. Ambedkar himself came from a military family, because particularly the Bombay and Madras armies prided themselves on, we take anybody, we're not stuck up. We don't have these we're not going to make caste a criterion. If you're a good physical specimen, as the colonial recruiting officer would have said, if you've got good military qualities, then we'll have you. So in fact, the army was very often a means of upward mobility out of the village, away from that Dalit identity. So that there were, in all sorts of different ways, low caste communities were differently impacted by colonialism. Now we have a Santosha GK again.
Professor O'Hanlon.
Yes.
We've run out of time really by 10 minutes.
Have I?
I'm being terribly
I'm really sorry.
here.
No, Well, I'm enjoying myself, and so
yes,
I
we all are.
time.
But the little announcement that I wanted to make before people leave, we will continue with Santosh's question, but before some people might want to leave. Tomorrow, we've been lucky to have been given a time slot by our Honorable Vice Chancellor. So he will be joining in here for the kind of a valedictory function tomorrow at 3 p.m. So 3 o'clock, we will first have a program with him, and the schedule will be slightly, postponed tomorrow. So after the function is over, not a function, but just I mean, this course is certainly something to boast about. So we would like to tell him, and he would also, of course, he deeply appreciates Madam's contribution to making this happen. So tomorrow we'll have that function at 3 o'clock. I'm saying function, but it will be a small interaction of about 15-20 minutes, not more. And then we will begin with the regular lectures. So please be here at 3 o'clock, like everybody does. But so we'll be joined by the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Nitin Karmarkar, tomorrow at 3 o'clock.
Well, that's very kind of him.
Now you can continue, Professor O'Hanlon. Sorry about this butting in. If you want, you can take Santosha's question now, or maybe tomorrow. How you feel like?
Let me take it just very briefly, and then we should let people go. How do we explore the history that wasn't written or documented, especially the history of the marginal and the Dalit? Well, Santosha, you will know that these days we have a very flourishing field of women's history. Now, 50 years ago, when some feminist historians thought that we should try to recover the history of these marginalized of women, what they were told was, you can't do that because there's no evidence. Nice idea, but sorry. That you simply won't find anything very much in the written record. And of course, fortunately, some women scholars, some feminist scholars didn't listen, and off they went. And when they looked, they did find evidence. And I think exactly the same position is there for the marginal and Dalit communities. In fact, there is plenty of evidence. You just have to go looking for it. So the evidence is there in legal records. The evidence is there in oral traditions. The evidence is there in military history. The evidence is there in some visual cultures. Mughal imperial painting, for example, has some wonderful images of pastoralist hunters, people who knew how to use a bow and arrow, who were accompanying the Mughal shikar because they knew where the animals were hidden. So there you have a very low caste person, and we can see an image of them. So it is a matter of looking imaginatively at for the history. So that's my encouragement to you. That there is plenty of evidence there. You just have to look for it. Okay, Jatin, well, thank you very much to you and to all of you for having been such a very good audience today. And I apologize to those of you who I have buttonholed. Thank you for bearing with me. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow and to greeting the Vice Chancellor. And thank you, Shraddha and Rahul, for your kind support in our session. See you all tomorrow.
See you.